Very Bad Wizards is a podcast with a philosopher, my dad, and a psychologist, Dave Pizarro, having an informal discussion about issues in science and ethics. Please note that the discussion contains bad words that I'm not allowed to say, and knowing my dad, some very inappropriate jokes.
I said to him, "You are aware that I am not really a wizard?" And he said, "Yes, I am aware of that. What I want you to do is to use your acting skills to portray the wizard."
The Great Boss has spoken! Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain!
Who are you? Who are you? A very bad man.
I'm a very good man. Good man. They think deep thoughts, and with no more brains than you have.
Pay no attention to that man!
Anybody can have a brain.
You're a very bad man.
I'm a very good man. Just a very bad wizard.
Welcome to Very Bad Wizards. I'm Tamler Summers from the University of Houston. Dave, March Madness is here, and by that I mean VBW Madness, our 16-topic tournament for the listener-selected episode. We picked the 16-team bracket last episode, and now the first round is underway. Our beloved patrons are voting. Who you got in the Final Four?
Okay, my top four, I think you got it right with the number one. I think Apocalypse Now is going to make it out. I also think Solaris is going to make it out. I think Invisible Cities might make it this time around. And then Twin Studies. I think those will be the final four. Is that exactly what you got? I mean, the numbers are the numbers. Like, we can't.
The top four seeds? Is that real? That's so boring. Oh, no, it's not the top four because Solaris is a 5 seed. So that's the only slight upset is what you have is Solaris over the Tempest.
Yeah. And like, if I was like truly wish casting, I would want the Passenger and Chalmers, but I guess we're doing that anyway. So
I don't know. Like, I don't know when we're going to do that if it doesn't win. I will say that. But I think Twin Studies will probably make it out of there at the bottom of the bracket. I don't know. Actually, I'll pick an upset. Even though I would love to do Invisible Cities and think we should, I think The Conversation might make it out.
That's a good one.
And that would be a real upset. That would be an 11 seed. I think it's currently beating The Overcoat right now. Sorry, all the Gogol heads out there, but we will do the Overcoat. We'll get to The Overcoat sooner rather than later, I think. But maybe not, so you better vote. If you like it. Gogol heads, don't wait for us.
I was rooting for Inventing Temperature. Like, I think I want to do that anyway.
Yeah, and that's going up against the Passenger Stella Maris, though. So, But I think, okay, so here's mine then. Apocalypse Now. I do think Solaris could do it. It's been in a lot of tournaments. It's gotten pretty close. So I'm going to say, that'll be one Final Four matchup, Apocalypse Now and Solaris. And the other one, I'll go The Conversation and Twin Studies. But, I'm not that confident about it.
Yeah. I hope people know that the Solaris, they've like encoded that it is the film and the book, for those people who want to make us suffer more.
Yeah, exactly. I think that would be very cool, though, and it would give us a really good chance to talk about like adaptation as an art, too.
Yeah, and different media and what it means.
Yeah. But that's not up to us to decide. So if you want to join the voting at the certain tier, you will get to vote on every round of this tournament until ultimately we have a winner. And that is a topic that we have to do. We are bound by obligation. We will suffer great illnesses if we don't follow through with that. And so we would likely do it, right?
Yes. And what a great segue to saying what we're going to talk about for our main segment. In our main segment, we're going to be talking about a Shweder et al. Paper on culture and moral psychology. I think, a foundational paper. But what are we doing first?
So first, we are doing a philosophy paper. It's been a while since we've done just a recent philosophy article. This one came out. When did it come out, actually?
2018.
2018 in the Journal of Value Inquiry, like a totally upstanding journal in ethics. And it's by Harry Chalmers, who I might have thought was David's less successful younger brother, but I don't think they're related, as far as I know, anyway.
Yeah. If anything, it would be son, I think, at this point.
Yeah, he does look kind of young, Harry Chalmers.
He's a young guy, yeah.
Based on the photographs that David has been sending me from the private detective. Yes.
Those were of me.
That's true. Those were of you. I couldn't. It was hard to tell because it wasn't your face,
You'd think you'd recognize me by now.
I always confuse your Johnson and Harry Chalmers.
Harry Chalmers now sounds like a dirty name.
Yeah,
Harry Palmers.
Well, maybe one reason why it sounds dirty is because he wrote a paper entitled, "Is Monogamy Morally Permissible?" And you may be surprised and may be grateful to learn that the answer is no. It is not. Monogamy is not morally permissible.
Shout out, by the way, to whoever error theorist is on Twitter, because he's been giving us some gold. This suggestion came from his Twitter account.
I think he might be the new neuroskeptic, because at least you don't have to go to Blue Sky for error theorist, I got to follow him. I don't even follow him. You found him and been putting him in Slack, and I think he's going to be a gold mine.
He really is.
Yeah, he's not being judgmental about
No,
these.
not at all.
Not even like a snide remark like neuroskeptic will sometimes do,
Yeah, no, he just says, here's a paper that argues that monogamy is morally impermissible, which is exactly what this paper does.
Yeah, he's not wrong. Yeah, so this is, I think, a paper that, might illustrate a lot of the problems that I have with analytic philosophy. It reads like, it's a very clearly written paper, and you understand the arguments, you understand the dialectic, you understand the debate. But I do also think there's something a little insane about it. And it's the same thing that's insane, I think, about a lot of analytic philosophy. So maybe as we talk through it, I can get at maybe, what that might be, and maybe it's me,
Maybe you just don't want to accept the truth.
Well,
but I thought it was interesting that it doesn't, there are defenses of non-monogamous relationships, open relationships. Like, I've certainly been exposed to a lot of those.
Yeah.
It's usually not aimed at arguing that monogamy is actually itself morally bad.
No, right. It's usually a defense of it. I mean, one of the tricks that Harry Chalmers pulls here is he switches the burden of proof and puts monogamy on the defensive. It's a nice rhetorical trick. I'm not sure if it's well justified. I think that might relate to some of the issues with it as well.
Yeah.
But
so here's, it seems as if the sole foundation on which this claim is resting, that monogamy might be morally impermissible, is this analogy that he makes to a relationship where you have a friendship and you don't permit the person to have any friendships besides your own.
yeah.
And your intuition at least my intuition is that this would be a morally unacceptable thing to require of another friend. Even, I guess, if it's your partner in the example. You're in a romantic relationship and you forbid your partner from having just non-romantic friends. And that is the sole source of that's the intuition pump for why monogamy itself might be morally impermissible. Is that?
Yeah, I think the way he puts monogamy on the defensive is he says, and I don't even think you have to be in a romantic relationship. You could say, here are two friends, and if one of them said the other one wasn't allowed to have any other friends, or, even requested that, that would be impermissible. And yes, and also with your romantic partner, if you did that with friendships, that would be impermissible. So if that's impermissible, what is it about sexual relationships that would justify that all of a sudden being okay to demand that your partner doesn't have any other sexual partners? I think that's the idea. And so the burden is to draw some kind of distinction, and then he considers a lot of different ways you could try to do that.
Right. And he does defend the intuition by saying like that he thinks that the source of the intuition for why it would be wrong to forbid your friend to have other friends is that, quote, friendships are an important human good. And when we're in a romantic relationship with someone, we should want our partner to have such goods in her life. At least we should want our partner to be free to pursue such goods as she sees fit. So like you're preventing them from acquiring the kinds of goods that are important for human life.
This isn't the same person as the compersion person, is it?
No, but he does rely, it seems, on that idea.
Yeah, instead of being like jealous, you should be like happy. Someone you love is having a really fulfilling sexual relationship.
Yeah, who are you to stop them?
That's great. Yeah, so this is what he says for monogamy on the defensive. We have seen how monogamous restrictions are prima facie analogous to a morally troubling no additional friends restriction.
We have seen it, yes.
We've seen it in the couple paragraphs in the introduction. The task for those who would defend monogamy. I really think this is kind of a brilliant paper in the way certain things are immediately assumed. The task for those who would dare to defend monogamy then is to find a morally relevant difference between the two kinds of restriction. There are broadly two ways in which one might try to find such a morally relevant difference. One, argue that the no additional friends restriction has bad-making features that monogamous restrictions lack. The bad-making features thing is something that absolutely drives me fucking crazy. It makes me want to blow up the APA one time.
It is the paper is written in my mind like the equivalent of the hottest shit on the streets, the latest Gen Z slang, but for philosophers.
Totally. The latest shit that people are talking about in these kinds of journals, and bad-making features is probably, the latest terminology. So that's number one, if you are a monogamy defender. Number two, argue that monogamous restrictions have good-making features that the no additional friends restriction lacks. He's being eminently reasonable. He's like, you could do one of these two things.
That's right. Those seem to exhaust the possibilities.
So how are you going to go about doing this? And so he says, you could say it would be a more onerous burden to say to your partner that they can't have additional friends than it would to say you can't have additional sexual partners. And so he says, I grant that, right? I grant that would be more onerous. Yet it is a morally relevant difference only in a weak sense. Namely, it suggests that the restriction on having additional friends is morally worse than monogamous restrictions. And this, of course, is not what the defender of monogamy needs, because it could still be that that's worse, but it's also bad to have a monogamous restriction, right? And to do that, the defender of monogamy will have to go beyond strategy one, which is this above. That is, she'll have to go beyond simply arguing that the restriction on having additional friends has bad-making features that monogamous restrictions lack.
Right. He tosses in a ceteris paribus in there. Some morally impermissible actions, after all, are worse than others.
Yeah, which is fair enough, right?
Yeah.
At this point, the defender of monogamy might say that while both kinds of restriction have this apparently bad-making feature, this is a problem only for the restriction on having additional friends, for this latter restriction seems to lack any justification. So, why would you restrict someone having additional friends? But when it comes to sexual and romantic relationships, there are good reasons why you shouldn't have other romantic relationships. But then, if you do that, you are opting for strategy 2, which is a more promising route than strategy 1. However, you still have to explain why monogamy is morally permissible while the restriction on having additional friends is not. You're totally right, by the way, that that's the whole thing that the paper relies on. Yeah. So then we get to the specialness defense.
Yeah. The rest of the paper is just the laying out the various defenses, right?
Yes. And, each one of these gets shot down. And we don't have to obviously go through all of this, but I think we should take a couple of them just because I think they share this same problem, which this just sounds like an alien writing about human beings and
really
sending the record back to their home planet. So the first example of this, I think, is here. So he says one common defense of monogamy is that monogamy helps one romantic relationships to be special. Many think that there is or can be a distinctive value in choosing and being chosen by just one person. This distinctive value, so this is one of the good-making feature, is enough to justify monogamy. The most obvious problem with this defense of monogamy is that it seems to apply equally to the case of friendship. If having only one partner makes for a more special romantic relationship, and if this value of this specialness is sufficient to justify monogamous restrictions, then it is difficult to see why having only one friend would not likewise make for a more special friendship, and why this specialness would not likewise justify the no additional friends restriction described earlier. So this is, I think, like, you could boil all my objections down to this. It's like, well, if people who are saying it's special to have only one like romantic relationship, that should be true of friends too. It should be exactly as much more special to only have one friend. But it's not. Like, it's just not. Like, this is the problem. It's like, well, what's the morally relevant difference here? It's like, it's just that people don't think that when it comes to friendship, and many people do think that when it comes to a romantic relationship.
I know. I was reading this and I was thinking, like, having two cupcakes really takes away from that one cupcake that you just had. And it's like, we don't think about all of these things in the same way. Like, one cupcake isn't more special than two cupcakes because, like, I had that second cupcake, right?
No. Or, like, if someone would say you don't like eggplant, and yet you like sweet potatoes. But there's no relevant difference between the sweet potatoes and eggplant. One might say that eggplant is less healthy than sweet potatoes, but it's far from clear that that's the case. Like, that's what all of these fucking things sound like. It's like...
Right. Like, it really is a striking lack of considering that people just like different things more. that like there is a psychology, that people have a psychology, and in that psychology, most people are perfectly fine with multiple friends and not, right? It's no work is being done here other than like showing that you sort of weirdly don't get that people don't like this.
Every difference in our kind of norms and inclinations and dispositions, they don't all need a kind of rational justification. That's just not how it fucking works. And, I'm sure he would say if he were here, well, that's what people used to say about like racism, like that's why racism was justified, or that's why burning heretics was justified. But the trick is to explain to someone why, like, that's true in one sense, it's like that, but it's not true for everything. It's not true for just these kinds of basic forms of life that we experience. Like, it doesn't all have to have some systematic, rational justification.
Yeah. Like, I even think that you could have a systematic, rational justification. He's just clearly, like, not looking at features that might provide that. I think he's giving short shrift to the kinds of features that people might reasonably point out to, like my sense of satisfaction or whatever, what I favor.
But my point is, it's a category mistake to think, well, if you think it's more special to have just a monogamous romantic relationship and you don't think that's true of friendship, then you need to find the special making difference between those two cases. And it's like, no, you don't. Like, certain things you find special and certain other things you don't find special, and you're not going to justify it. You might not even be able to explain it. It's just what it is.
Yeah.
It'd be one thing if he said, yes, but we punish people for having affairs and stuff like that. And if that was the case, then, like, there's separate issues, but I would be more okay with it. But in this case, it's that monogamy is impermissible because you can't justify the fact that nobody except some weirdo would think you can only have one friend, and that makes it, otherwise the friendship isn't special. But that's just not true in the case of monogamous relationships.
Yeah. So, like, what bugs me about this argument, well, a couple things. One, what you said, I also totally agree with. But you could easily imagine this structure of this argument flipped to say, you know how people have multiple friends? Well, I'm going to argue that it is morally impermissible to have multiple friends. So let me give you an example. I have a romantic partner. I think they should not be sleeping around with other people. I think that's obvious to everybody's intuition that like we should be not cheating on our partners. So what is there to like, why would you think that it's permissible to have multiple friends? And that's as strong an argument because they both rely on a fundamental intuition to begin with.
Yeah. Well, but I mean, he would be like, yes, exactly. Right. Like you could make
well,
that
it's the opposite. Yeah.
Yeah. Except that like it would be your reductio is another person's modus tollens or whatever.
Exactly.
Like, modus tollens is another modus tollens. Like, but you just don't have to justify the fact that you value one type of thing more than you value another type of thing. You don't have to find the relevant difference. It's just kind of how it works. So like, this is a good example of, I think, the disconnect. He says, I can think of only one reason why one might think that monogamy helps one's relationship to be special. Like, it doesn't need a reason. It's just like how the people view it. It's like, so the one reason, he says, if one understands special to mean exclusive, under this understanding of special, monogamy indeed helps one's relationships to be special. This, of course, follows trivially, but surely there is more to this defense of monogamy than the trivially true claim that monogamous relationships are more exclusive than non-monogamous relationships. It's like, nobody would say that because they wouldn't have thought that they would have to justify that because it doesn't have to be justified. Yeah. This is over-intellectualizing the facts more than Strawson, like P.F. Strawson, like ever dreamed philosophers were capable of, I think. I do think, like, in that sense, like, he was reacting against exactly this temperament. And that paper is somewhat prophetic in predicting that this is where philosophers were heading.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I do think it's worth talking about, like, primarily because the knee-jerk rejection that people have of non-monogamy. And, like, I think there are people for whom it is obvious that a non-monogamous relationship is what they want and what they want in a partner. And then that's fine, right? It's just that, like, for most people, these are the things that they want. And you don't need to call this one impermissible just to defend the other one. Like, we can say both cases, like, hey, it seems like a reasonable thing to have just like, what are you looking for in a romantic partner? And the things that you are looking for seem like very reasonable ways with which to select the person you want to be with. And the value of being with one person and all of like the good shit that we think like happens in a loyal monogamous relationship. You don't need to tear it down with this like weird intellectualizing, like, it's not even just like abstracted too much. It's stripped of all psychological meaning when he makes these arguments. It's like weird.
Completely stripped. That's what's insane about it, is it pretends that there is no like human psychology and we're all just figuring out how to get all of our tastes and values and beliefs, and we're just all trying to make it into one kind of perfectly consistent framework. And it's just like, that's not how it works. Like, if it would work like that, it should work like that for the kinds of movies we like and the kinds of, like, the fact that we like this friend better than that friend. Yeah. Like, there's certain things that don't permit of rational justification, as Strawson said, about, like, is it ever okay to blame somebody? He's like, now that's a lot more controversial claim than for something like this. But I think the point is the same. Like, it neither calls for nor permits rational justification to think that having one friend is less special than having one romantic partner. It just doesn't.
Yeah. Here's where, like, I also resist, like, I agree with you, like, justification, you know, serious justification, but that also doesn't mean that you don't have reasons. You know, like, your reason can just be, I don't like it. Yeah. And I like it, you know, like, that's, it's not. And you see this when he gets to jealousy, where his way of dealing with the jealousy defense is simply to say, yeah, but like, it's dumb to be jealous. So like, let's not be dumb.
Yeah.
Like, it's
like that's all we have to do. Well, he says, like, because he asks, like, why would you feel jealous? You know, like, here your partner is finding joy. You should have compersion instead of jealousy. Like, it's right there. And he says, the answer, I think, can only be that we feel jealous precisely because we are less rational and less mature than we could be. Were it not for certain unreasonable fears and preoccupations that burden our minds, we would react to our partner's new love in the way that is so evidently called for, by simply being happy for him.
I hate this because it's this way of talking about emotions that put the cart before the horse, where it's like, no, the very reason that you're jealous is because there is something that you value that is being threatened. it is not that like the jealousy is kicking in and you're like, oh man, if only I could truly endorse the things I value.
Yeah.
No, like it's you're jealous because it's reflecting that you do not want something to happen, that you fear.
But see, he's already attacked the justification for the value of like the specialness of the monogamous relationship. So unfortunately, it's not clear that that defense will hold.
You should also,
Yeah.
Yeah. Just like taking a step back, I've noticed that there is a weird divide in the psychology of people who are totally fine with non-monogamy and the rest of us. And I'm okay with that. Like maybe that's a deep divide. Maybe that's like fucking inner voice levels of divide. And if that's the case, then I want everybody to be happy. But does read as if there's somebody who just fundamentally does not understand what's going on in the mind of people who are into monogamy.
I mean, it's just, it's almost like you wouldn't know, like if you had to respond to this, like in print, like how to go about it, you know?
I know, I don't want to tackle those stupid arguments.
So like when he's talking about the practicality defense, this is very funny. He says, there is an improved version of the practicality defense. Specifically, one might propose that not merely time and energy management, but considerations of people's emotional limitations can justify monogamy. Given the emotionally demanding nature of romantic relationships, along with our own emotional limitations, it is entirely legitimate to focus our attention on developing one relationship at a time and to expect our partner to do the same. But, he says, this won't fly. Even if we grant that a single romantic relationship will leave us emotionally exhausted, allowing casual sex on the side seems just as much a solution as opting for full-blown monogamy. But surely this won't do, some will object, for what starts as a bit of casual sex on the side can easily become something more serious. If we wish for security and stability, we must stick to monogamy. This maneuver, I must say, strikes me as that's great, actually. I actually really like that. Strikes me as tenuous. And then goes on to bring the friendship like he always does.
I mean, I am convinced that you should have no other friends than me.
You've often made that demand on me. And
like God says, I am a jealous God. Thou shalt have no other gods before me.
Since I'm so committed to monogamy, I guess I got to do it, right? Because there's no.
I like that. I like that somebody's gonna read this and be like, "I've been irrational this whole time, honey. Go ahead and fuck that really hot guy with a huge cock."
Or they'll be like, "Hi," like they'll go down their list and they'll be like, call all of them except one and say, "I can't be friends with you. Can't be friends with you. Can't be friends with you. Can't be friends with you." Like, I guess you could really do either.
You know what? One of the objections that he doesn't consider, I think, is a good one is. Whenever this happens, like say a couple is monogamous and they're like, let's say that they're like, yeah, we're being irrational. Let's open it up. It's always one of them that's going to get all the action and the other one's going to be like, shit.
Well, this is what we've always talked about with these kinds of papers. Yeah. And it's always the one that's kind of defending it. I think that's usually the one that's not going to be able to take advantage of it. I don't know what the psychology is then.
I don't know either. And I've seen plenty of stories where somebody's like finally convinces their wife to be non-monogamous and then she's just getting laid every weekend.
Yeah. And it's usually, I would say, the woman.
I think that's how it works.
Because they don't respect the guy for agreeing to it. Like that's the thing.
Also, they can just go get sex.
Yes, exactly. It is much easier. Yeah, it's a very interesting contrast, this paper with the next paper. Like I would say they are on two opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of like how much respect to give to people's actual practices and actual like emotions.
Right, that's right. But you know what? Good for you, Harry Chalmers. He has a Substack where if you want to read more about the back and forth with other philosophers that he's had regarding non-monogamy, it's called Noetic Pathways.
And to be clear to all the VBW female fans, I don't think either of us are saying that.
No, cheating is okay. Yeah, this wasn't about cheating.
This wasn't about, okay.
You're such a dick.
All right, we'll be right back to talk about Richard Shweder and colleagues' paper, The Big Three of Morality and the Big Three Explanations of Suffering.
Welcome back to Very Bad Wizards. This is that time of the episode where we like to remind you how much we appreciate you. May get repetitive for you, but we always like to do it because we do appreciate all of the ways in which you keep us going. We would not be here without you. If you want to engage with us, you can email us, verybadwizards@gmail.com. Again, we read everything. We don't have time to respond to everything, but we see it. You can tweet or blue sky at us at Tamler at Peas or at Very Bad Wizards. You can engage in conversations with some fellow listeners on Reddit by going to reddit.com/r/verybadwizards. You can also follow us on Instagram at Very Bad Wizards. And if you so choose, you can give us ratings on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify or even leave us a review. We very much appreciate that. And if you'd like to support us in those other tangible ways that keep the lights on for us, you can go to our website and click support, and there you'll find some links. You can buy some swag. You can donate to us via PayPal one time or recurring, or you can join our Patreon. And if you do that, we give stuff back to you. We love the community that's grown there. We love interacting with everybody, and we very much appreciate that. If you want to join and you just want to show some support, maybe you just care about getting a back catalog that's full of the ad-free episodes and getting a few beats while you're there, you can do that for only $2 a month. If you move up to the next tier, the beginning of our bonus tiers, you get access to hundreds of hours of bonus content, including our Deadwood podcast series, the Reintegrators series that we did with Paul, lots of one-off episodes with Tamler and with some guests from everything from the Sopranos episodes, David Lynch stuff, Star Trek episodes on The Leftovers. Lots of stuff there, too much to mention in this segment. You'll also get access to our monthly Ask Us Anything series. That'll pop up in your RSS feed or in your podcast player of choice. At the $10 a month and up, you'll get all of that, plus access to our 5 Brothers Karamazov series, some intro psych video lectures that I did, some of Tamler's Plato lectures, and you also will get the ability to vote on an episode topic. We do that a couple times a year. Finally, at the $20 tier, you get everything that I just mentioned, plus you get to be the ones to ask us questions for our monthly Ask Us Anything, and you also get to see us answering those awkwardly on video, unedited on video. I know, it seems like it's worth hundreds and hundreds of dollars for that, but only $20 a month. So thank you once again to everybody. Your continued support means the world to us. Your messages, comments, and interactions are food for our soul. Thank you, everybody. And now back to the episode. All right, let's get to our main topic. Today we're discussing, as Tamler said, a paper called The Big Three of Morality, Autonomy, Community, and Divinity, and the Big Three Explanations of Suffering by Richard Shweder, Nancy Much, I'm assuming, Manamohan Mahapatra, and Lawrence Park. This is a paper that was published in 1997 in a collected volume that was edited by Brandt and Rozin, Paul Rozin, who we've discussed before, on a volume about health. And so this paper is focused on how humans across cultures make sense of suffering And it does so by analyzing the systems of explanation for suffering that humans seem to rely on across cultures. They refer to these systems of explanation as causal ontologies, and they focus on what they see as the three most widespread ones that we'll talk about. In the process of presenting this cross-cultural work on how we deal with suffering, they also introduce this big three of moral ethics: autonomy, community, and divinity. And they argue that there are different moral systems that privilege different kinds of explanations for suffering. So in the West, that is focused on autonomy. The causal story that we rely on is the biomedical one, where we treat disease and distress and death as explained by physical or biological causes of affliction. But in moral systems that emphasize community and divinity, they rely on different causal explanations for suffering, such as interpersonal ones and moral ones. So this paper, what I really wanted to get to in this intro is an explanation for why I think this is one of the most important papers in moral psychology and why I was excited to read it. Because it's really been influential, and it's been cited a couple thousand times, but that doesn't really track how influential it is, because this introduction of the idea that there might be different moral foundations across cultures is what Jonathan Haidt and Jesse Graham really built their moral foundation theory on. They took this notion that you might have something like an ethics of autonomy, of community and divinity, and they expanded this to create their moral foundations. But they brought along with it the idea that's introduced in this article that these are intuitive systems that are emphasized more in some cultures rather than others, but that they are part of human universals. We all have these intuitions, and we just rely on some more than others depending on the culture that we're brought up in. And the other thing that I'm sure we'll talk about is that this paper is just chock full of just interesting anthropological data. This is built on work that was done in India by interviewing people across the span of months, with locals playing a role in translation and helping them understand what's going on. There's just nuance and richness to the way that culture is discussed and the way that these frameworks for understanding cultures is discussed. And it's a nuance that I think that has just been lost in the modern incarnations of these ideas, where we're focused on like distilling these down to some sort of essential belief that can be put in a statement and inserted into a measure. And I think in doing all of that, we've really lost the richness, because like at the end of reading this paper, I'm struck by the richness and the complexity and the dirtiness of what human psychology is in a way that I just am not by modern psychology.
Yeah, like it just respects and recognizes the complexity of our beliefs and the different ways we try to make sense of what happens to us in a way that, you know, obviously I agree that social psychology has strayed from, and, you know, in its own way, I think analytic philosophy has strayed from, and the paper we did in the opening is a great example of that. And I guess I agree with you that he thinks the biomedical explanations are predominant for us in the West as opposed to India. But I think he also thinks kind of moral explanations. Well, two things. Number one, that it does sneak its way into our folk psychology and the way we talk about in ways that aren't kind of officially licensed by our scientific and naturalist way of trying to understand the world. So it sneaks its way in, number one. And number two, I think he thinks like we're really like losing something. Like I've read a bunch of Shweder papers, and I've never seen him place the thumb on the scale so much kind of against our way of understanding and conceptualizing and approaching illness and health. And like I think he really kind of lays his cards pretty heavily with, you know, some of these other cultures that are willing to engage, you know, metaphysical, supernatural, moral, kind of karmic ways of explaining certain ills. You know, there are times he sounds downright contemptuous of like Americans and their market-driven way of trying to explain all of this. And I really enjoyed that too. You know, I can imagine it might be controversial, but I fully enjoyed it. And, you know, it's rare you see that much like laying your normative cards on the table that you do in this, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I knew you would enjoy that end part. I mean, that at the heart of this is this view that what we're doing really, like you said, is we're trying really hard to ignore all of the natural ways of explanation that we engage in anyway. And so what we're doing by focusing solely on the biomedical is trying to endorse something that's inconsistent with what we fundamentally believe about the way things work. And he has like a nice discussion of what he means, or what I should say, they mean by causation here. Because when they talk about folk causation, they're really not talking about, the way that scientists understand causation. And they say, look, like when people are talking about causes, they're often talking about interpersonal causes, who's responsible, who should be blamed. And he says, in folk psychology, the idea of causation does not rule out the possibility of influence at a distance. It does not rule out influence by unobservable forces. It does not demand attention to all necessary conditions. It does not treat all necessary conditions as equally relevant or as of the same kind. And again, like this is the kind of nuance that I think is important, where even if I, like in my sort of cold, rational science tells us everything, it would be short shrift to say that it's not a deep part of my psychology to think about like, what did I do to deserve this?
Yeah.
Or, what unobservable forces might have caused this? And as they point out later, like this isn't always irrational. Like we might actually be ignoring important causal chains by trying to focus solely on the physical, the biophysical.
Yeah, and he notes that like when we're talking about causes for accidents, like if you're talking about something bursting into flames, you don't say, oxygen was a cause of that, but instead like it's just your practical considerations is going to orient what you will think the cause of. Or a car skidding off the road because the person was driving too fast. From one perspective, you blame the person. That's what caused the accident. From another explanation, you could blame the road because, it wasn't skid-proof enough. You could also blame the car and focus on those causes. And his point is all these causes there's no one that is more kind of rational to believe than the other. So it's often just like the emphasis, the practical considerations or, spiritual considerations might lead us to focus on certain causes as the cause and not even recognize the other ones. It's not that you would deny that they were part of it. It's just that you don't think of it as like the cause. The one that you would use to explain what happened to somebody else,
Right. Yeah. There's so much in this paper that ended up sort of like having this influence on future moral psychology. Like, as you were talking about that, like there is, the Graham and Haidt stuff is attempting to point out that like maybe this diversity of thought should be understood as not superior or inferior. But you also have like all of the weird stuff, the Joe Henrich stuff, that's such an important part of the point that they're making here is that most of the world, and they even present some data, like most of the world doesn't think in terms of the causal ontology of the biomedical, but rather they think in terms of interpersonal and moral. So, like most people in the world still think about envious neighbors or dominating relatives or ancestral spirits or witches or the evil eye. Like all of those things are playing a heavy role in the causal ontologies of most people in the world. And our little slice of the world is an exception.
Yeah. And even us, how often do we think in terms of jinxes or...
Absolutely. Knock on wood.
Yeah, knock on wood and like, this is what I deserve,
Yeah, they had it coming.
He talks about karma. Like we talk about karma in like ordinary life. Like we think about it and you kind of have to force yourself not to think in those terms, even for us having been brought up, in this Western culture that values science and looks skeptically at any kind of either supernatural or not fully like evidence-based kind of explanation. And yet we're still drawn to them like in just our ordinary thought and the way we talk with people a lot of the time.
Yeah, even medical doctors. Like in some ways there's just no way to get around like that there's a causal nexus that is a person.
Yeah.
right? And that person makes choices and that they're responsible for their health in some way. And so obviously that's truer in some cases than in other cases. But I also just love the way that, there's this complexity to the way that they present these three like ethics of autonomy, divinity, and community that you also don't see in more modern takes on this, where they're talking about like, look, it's not as if in South Asia, so in these communities in India, in Oriya, where they're studying these people, it's not as if they don't have notions of autonomy and individuals and rights. But you really have to take into consideration that what they mean when they're talking about an individual isn't, as they refer to it, like the Western transcendental ego, like the self that is, within the boundaries of this time and space that, say, I believe in, but rather the self is a spiritual entity that has an existence across multiple lives.
Yeah.
And so when they are talking about autonomy, it's under that lens as well.
And
right?
also that, ultimately this is all part of some underlying like formless reality, and individuals and their actions are just expressions of this larger, whatever they call it, Brahman or Atma or whatever, like this ultimate reality that these things are. So even the individuals and even the karmic connections between individuals from life to life, or even within a individual life, are still also connected to everybody else and ultimately everything that actually exists. So like their metaphysics, which I don't like with us, doesn't really play, I don't think, maybe a huge part in the big three explanations. It's just very different than our understanding.
Yeah.
Okay, so I have one question about like the structure of this paper and then also its importance in the way you described it. So this isn't the first time that he's presenting the big three: autonomy and harm, community, and...
I think it is.
No, because the Height 93 paper talks about this and references Shweder.
Yeah, it does. So I'm not sure what they cite of Shweder. So there's a paper in 1987, Shweder, Mahapatra, and Miller, that reports on some of this work as well. Like there, it's more focused on moral development and their notions of moral development. But every moral foundations paper, at least since this paper, cites this one.
Because it's the most like...
maybe fleshed out one.
Yeah. And with all those different kinds of moral violations. But what I initially thought was, he's taking his 3, which Height then expands to 5 or 6, I think at some point, of these kinds of foundations, and he's applying it to suffering. But then it's a weird structure of the paper that the bulk of it, the middle of it, is focused on the big 3 and really doesn't talk about suffering at all. Suffering only gets brought back into it later into the papers. But yeah, there is a Height paper that Shweder's not even on, where he talks about the big 3. You know which one I'm talking about?
No, because I know the Height and Joseph paper that's like their first one.
Affect Culture and Is It Wrong to Eat Your Dog? That one.
Yeah, so that one is citing the original Shweder 1987 paper. So in like this data collection that Shweder did in these people in Oriya, India, he published a few papers on it, and one was in 1987 where it has a really full account of all of the moral violations of people in 2 communities in India and in 2 communities in the United States. And there, I do think they talk about the different ethics of autonomy and community divinity. But this is the one that lays it out most formally, that there are these 3 and that they are linked to these causal ontologies, these interpersonal, moral, and biomedical. And so this is the paper that gets cited nowadays by almost every paper on moral foundations that is published.
Okay.
Yeah. Really, they're talking about these in-depth interviews that were done by Park. I don't know who the other authors are. And so they reproduce a list of purported moral violations that are coded by whether they're violations of autonomy, divinity, or community. Here's actually one of the things that I love about this, because even here in this paper, you see this list of 39 moral violations or purported moral violations, such as a widow and an unmarried man loved each other. The widow asked him to marry her, right? A boy played hooky from school. At night, a wife asks the husband to massage her legs.
I love those. A
they're
woman
so
is
many.
playing cards at home with her friends. Her husband is cooking rice for them. That's like
Right.
a moral violation. I want to live in this culture.
In a family, a 25-year-old son addresses his father by his first name.
Yeah.
And what they have in this table where they list these out isn't even like ratings of whether they're, how wrong they are, but rather to what extent they are like hitting on one of these ethical codes of autonomy, community, or divinity. And so they actually just give like low, medium, or high rating for each of these violations. So some of them are low in terms of like how much they're about autonomous violations like harms and rights and justice, and high in the other two. Some of them are high in all three. Some of them are medium in all three. Like, this already is more nuanced than the way that we study moral foundations, where like they take these statements and they just assume that it is one or the other.
Yeah.
And that's just not how people think. And this has actually been a problem in measurement, where you're just like, well, that's actually hitting on a couple of different things, but you're just saying that it is a measure of whatever purity.
Yeah. Because there would be way too much noise and there would be too many confounding factors if you admitted that like a lot of these things might be working at the same time in ways that are not easy to isolate. Yeah, so here's an example. He says, using the one, my favorite, a given stretch of text could instantiate more than one category. For an example, if an informant expressed her moral condemnation of the events in Incident 4, a woman is playing cards at home with her friends, her husband is cooking rice for them, by stating, the wife is the servant of the husband. The servant should do her work. The rationale would be coded as both hierarchy and duty.
And this is, again, these are like in-depth interviews where they get, and this is what I love about the 1987 paper as well, where they like list out all of these moral violations. They don't just list them and leave it at that one sentence. They all have stories attached to them and rich explanations that they asked people about, so that they can really assess what's going on in their psychology, or at least in the psychology that they're able to report.
Yeah.
So that they can get a better sense of what it means to think in terms of community or divinity, and how it often happens that it's all mixed together.
Yeah. So after listing all that for them and stating that for them, divinity and, the hierarchy, community, duty, that those play a much bigger role than they do for us, how can we try to understand this without just kind of dismissing it? And, he says, at the one hand, we're not going to try to get you to adopt the metaphysics of, an Indian Brahmin, but we do want to, call attention to the fact that there are these neglected ideas that are in our own cultural history that manifest themselves in ways that make more sense in terms of our own norms rather than the Hindu norms. And that's the thing that I am going to try to get you to do. And here's where I think he gets kind of contemptuous. So one of the things he tries to say is they have a more feudal society where there's kind of a man at the head, and the man has obligations towards the people under him that he has to take care of them, and he has to legitimately do that. But then the people under him also have obligations. This is why something that seems unobjectionable, you guys want some rice? You're playing mahjong or whatever? Sure, I'll make you some rice. But for them, that kind of violates, I guess, that kind of feudal ethics metaphor. And he says, of course, we are going to bucket that, not because we're too science-pilled, but because of our, legitimate worries about people being oppressed and rights and things like that. But what you lose when you abandon that whole way of thinking is this idea that people should care about each other at all, and that they might have actual obligations to care for people who are less powerful than you, that it's not just every person for himself. So he says most Americans ideologically recoil at the idea of feudal ethics because a feudal ethic does not fit well with the philosophical underpinnings of our historically evolved political culture and our free market mentality. we shall try to explicate a few major principles of feudal ethics in terms that Americans, who underplay this aspect of experience in their dealings with persons, quote, can understand. So I love that. He's like, I'm going to try to explain it to you, like, in ways that you, like, money worshipping, like, McDonald's eating, like, 48-ounce soda, like, guzzling fat fucks that you are. I'm going to try to explain this in terms that you'll understand. This is where I think he does get kind of contemptuous almost of the way that we handle it, in part because I think he thinks it's impoverished, and also in part because he seems to think that it's, like we sometimes talk about, making us more atomized, and then also it's very, like, market driven. You know, it's that we're so focused on, like, money and the freedom to get money and acquire it and keep it, you know?
Yeah. So my more positive spin on that, but I agree with you, is that when he's then saying, like, I'll explain it in a way that you might understand, like, this is a part of your thinking that you've, like, neglected, but that nonetheless is available to you.
Yeah.
I wanted to read, like, this description that he has of how to think about these discourses of morality, where he talks about them as culturally coexisting. And so he says, discourses are symbol systems for describing aspects of experience. More than one such symbol system may be applicable to any area of experience, such as individuals' psychological development, ethics, health, or suffering. There is no reason that one must select one and only one discourse to represent an area of experience. Indeed, there may be some advantage in possessing multiple discourses for covering the complexities of such an important area of human experience as ethics. No discourse corresponds so tightly to facticity that it cannot be separated from it. All discourses describe through interpretation and inference. And this is the part that I love, that I thought you would endorse as well. Experience is often so complex that its facticity is sometimes better described by one discourse and sometimes by another. Although different discourses in the social sciences and elsewhere, say behaviorist, cognitivist, and object relation schools of psychological development, often seem to be in competition for one definition of a realm of experience, this is usually a sociological effect more than a logical one. It is often advantageous to have more than one discourse for interpreting a situation or solving a problem, not only alternative solutions, but multi-dimensional ones addressing several orders of reality or orders of experience may be more practical for solving complex human problems. And in that is just like an acceptance of the complexity of human life and human culture. There's so much said there, like about how when we compete for sole explanation, what we're doing is basically a sociological fact, not one that's truly capturing reality.
Yeah.
And there's also something in there that I seem to be reading about how you need to understand this through all of the other lenses of your culture. Like when you think about autonomy and somebody else in a different culture thinks about it, you know, there's different content to it. There's a whole bunch of different cultural assumptions that might go into it. But nonetheless, you know, these are modes of thinking. It's just not easy to say, oh, isn't it crazy that Indians believe that a husband can't cook for the wife? Like, if you say that and leave it at that,
yeah, then it is
it's just
crazy.
like, what the fuck? Yeah.
No, that's right. That you have to consider it in the, like, a holistic context to truly understand it. Never mind be like charitable and not just think, oh, this is like a deeply patriarchal and oppressive society, which it may ultimately turn out to be, but you can't just do it based on like isolating certain norms or beliefs or codes out of its context. He says, the policies of the feudal system are not necessarily easy for democratic-minded Americans to appreciate. The contemporary American mistrust of hierarchy and ready-made association of hierarchy with tyranny, exploitation, and overreaching entitlement seems to reflect what happens to hierarchy in a democratic market society, where take care of one's own is replaced by survival of the fittest. So he's saying, like, yes, hierarchy in a free market capitalist society is bad, but there are, you know, you switch the cultures and you switch the whole structure of how people relate to each other, and it might not be as bad, all things considered, but you have to take it all. You can't just take part of it. And,
That's right.
And, you know, similarly, you can't celebrate our, like, love of, like, process and procedural justice and genuine, at times, respect at times for people's, like, individual rights. You can't take that out of context either.
That's
and
right.
you can't even take some of the cheap shots he put, like the fact that we're so money worshipping and like, like even that has to be considered in terms of what it does allow people to do, even if it cuts away at some of our communal bonds and relationships. So it's really great stuff in that way.
Yeah. And, on that note about like hierarchy, it might seem that this free market democratic society is a bit allergic to hierarchy, but like, damn if it isn't just rearing its head that deep down, a lot of people still desire hierarchy and that this scratches an itch that like humans have, right? And it's like the battle to eliminate modes of hierarchy that are unjust, like on our ethic, have had to do a lot of work to disabuse people of like these very deeply instilled notions about how society should be organized. And it's still there. Like we are.
Yeah.
Like
clearly. Right.
Yeah.
And I think his point is that even if we could squash it like entirely, and we're not doing a good job of that right now, but even if we could, like there would be costs to that. The costs probably coming in terms of people's sense that you should give a shit about other people. Like that those two things are sometimes inextricably bound. And so like, again, I'm not sure if he's right about that, but I see what his point is that when you focus all your attention on one aspect of morality without examining what effects it has on other aspects of morality, that's short-sighted. And you could almost argue, as I feel like he sometimes is here, that it's a big failure of like liberalism, like political liberalism, that they don't recognize some of the costs. They're so tunnel vision focused on like harm and justice and rights, and especially procedural rights, that a lot of the other stuff that's genuinely good, like communal bonds and sense of obligation and emphasis on building and cementing interpersonal relationships, that is a good thing. And you see in this paper that he thinks we are losing that to a degree. And then he does a similar thing with like the stuff about divinity, I think. I was wondering what you thought about like that part of the paper.
Yeah, I mean, I find it fascinating. So like so much of like the discussion here about like the Hindu worldview and karma specifically is, so I'll just say this, like I think that it's absolutely makes sense that the notion of karma has entered our vocabulary, because I just think it's picking up on like metaphysics aside, it's picking up on such a natural way of thinking about the world. But here's what I love is there's always like this narrative attached to these like lessons, like there's this story about, like you mentioned, the person that becomes made into a dog. Like there's just a rich narrative that weaves together the way that they understand how karma works. So when you ask what I think about it, like I'm jealous of having like such a rich spiritual worldview, because I just don't have that.
Yeah. And, he kind of goes back and forth between these things do pop up. We do talk about this, but then like officially we're not supposed to accept these explanations. But then other times I think, and especially with this, he thinks that often what this does is actually less rational, even by our own lights. Because, so for example, with our focus on biomedical explanations, we often just ignore the fact that in an individual might have brought about their own illness. If I get like a liver disease, you can explain it as some biomedical thing, like some, but like if somebody says, well, you shouldn't have been drinking so much, like that would be, and people would say that about something like that, but maybe they would be hesitant to say that about someone with diabetes who was obese or something like that. Yeah. And so what he says is the focus on just that level of explanation often just blinds us to the fact that we do have some control sometimes over our health. And sometimes, although we don't like to say it like this, it is our fault that we are sick. And it's not just victim blaming to acknowledge that. Like this is a very proto, I don't know, like...
no, I know. This would not, like, I feel like he would have trouble saying this in a modern journal.
Yeah, it does feel like in social psychology, they would find some objections, like moral objections with this, not like woke or whatever.
Yeah. So I will say, like, I don't know Rick Shweder well, but proto-anti-woke, I think, is a good way of describing him.
But in a much better way than like any modern anti-woke.
But this is all like much better. Like, again, I think that the richness and like the nuance that is presented here is just lost in the modern ways.
Yeah, I agree.
Let me tell a quick story about like our last episode where we discussed Shweder's paper on shame. An acquaintance of mine, like a listener of the show, Seamus Power, worked with Shweder and sent him our episode. And Shweder listened and reached out and said that he really liked it. And he ended up assigning it for one of his seminars. Like they had to listen to our discussion of Very Bad Wizards. But I will say, like, what I knew about him from before was that he was always willing to say shit that like people might not have really wanted to hear.
Well, this is his time again, you know. Like, this is his time to shine right now. No, that's not fair to say because he is just a much, you know, and it might not even be fair to say. Like, I almost regret even bringing it up. But there are a lot of things where he seems to be pushing back against like victim culture, you know, without denying that people are oppressed and exploited. And he couples that with a very kind of, it seems like, skepticism about free market values and all of that.
Yeah. But so, like, can I just read a little part where he talks about that victim part?
Yeah.
Because, like, he even has more nuance here than most people nowadays do. He says, there's a problem when victimization becomes the dominant account of suffering and when it becomes quote unquote politically incorrect ever to hold people responsible for their misery. The problem is that descriptions of agents as victims ironically depersonalize the sufferer. The sufferer is described and encouraged to envision himself or herself as a passive victim, which is hardly a more health-inducing description than villain. If the victim has no fault, neither has he or she any control over or responsibility for remedial action. The victim's only recourse is reliance on the intervention of experts, quote unquote, and on people with resources of power and knowledge that constitute the means for remedial action. The sufferer is seen as possessing no resources and capabilities of his or her own that could ameliorate present conditions and future prospects. It's like there's some compassion there.
Absolutely. And I think he's pointing out, like, it's a little like taking the objective attitude towards somebody. By saying, oh, you're just a victim, you're kind of stripping away their agency. And because of that, even if it's not your intention, you are stripping away their sense that they have any control over what happens. And then he also points out that often it's the people who are sick that are least likely to embrace that kind of explanation.
I love this. Like, he says, what is ironic about the rhetoric of not, quote unquote, blaming the victim is how often the victim is the most difficult person to convince of this position.
Yeah.
Therapy may be necessary to provide the intensive persuasion needed to make sufferers agree that they are not to blame. The no blame position, this objective position, seems in fact to be somewhat counterintuitive to sufferers. After all, suffering feels like punishment. And that's just, I think, whether it's right or wrong that somebody caused their own suffering is independent of the psychological fact that the person suffering often feels like they are wrong, like that they did something wrong. And I remember even as a little kid, if like I hurt myself, I would think like, oh, did I do something like that? Like, was it me?
I rarely think that. I feel like I think that I'm being very unfairly treated by the world.
You have the like long karma samsara version.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, I think we all have that sometimes. And I think that's a deep psychological thing. And it's just again, this is like objecting to liberals being compassionate for people in ways that they don't actually want, and they might even be offended by, or they might find disrespectful. And that part of it is interesting and in some ways connected to this idea that we need to respect the richness and the kind of interconnections of all the different aspects of morality rather than focusing on just one kind, because that's going to lead us to make both moral and even just rational mistakes.
Yeah. That's right. So he says, what is surprising is the insistence with which so many secular scientific scholars in the West choose to analyze that commonplace mental association as some kind of problem or pathology or primitivism, rather than asking what kind of wisdom might be expressed by such recalcitrant human thoughts and attitudes. And that notion that we want to shuffle some of our intuitions into like the primitive, or when we see it so explicit in another culture, to call them primitive is something that like this is communicating well, that this is probably the wrong way to approach it.
Yeah. And, they say at the beginning, I think it's kind of their mission statement. They say, related to what you just quoted towards the end, it is our assumption that ideas about human experience that persist long or are widespread or become invested with social meaning and established as folk theories in a major region of the world are not likely to be merely primitive or superstitious. It is our assumption that such ideas illuminate some aspect of mind, experience, or society and can be put to use not only to construct a valuable cultural psychology, but to extend our moral imagination. So, the kind of guiding core belief here is that if there's an idea that's been sticking around forever in a big part of the world, it is illuminating something about the human mind, and you can't just dismiss it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I want just to give maybe some parting thoughts about what this says for modern social psychology.
Yeah.
Because I've been thinking about this. Well, a couple things. One, Shweder wrote a book in 1991 called Thinking Through Cultures, which is sort of his manifesto of cultural psychology. And I remember reading it in college and liking it. It was influential, but I remember thinking that he was too much on the relativist side of things, whereas I was more drawn to kind of the nativists and the universals.
And Kantianism.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that if I revisited it, I would understand a bit more what he was trying to say. It's I feel like I probably didn't do it justice in my 19-year-old mind. But when I read a paper like this and I think about the kind of work that we're doing in social psychology, and this is the stuff that you and I have talked about so much, talking about Ash and Rozin and those sort of critiques of what modern social psychology has become. I was just having a dinner with a guest speaker, social psychologist, actually Dave Dunning of the famous Dunning-Kruger effect.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he used to be here at Cornell. And he asked, what do you think is the future of social psychology? And one of the people at the dinner was saying, well, I hope we get back to actually doing studies with people, interacting with people and not just collecting data over the internet. And people agreed, but then I said but we're in a kind of catch-22 because we know through methodological reform that doing studies with 15, 20 people per condition is just not enough to tell us anything. That's how P hacking runs rampant. And we know that we need way more people to do the kinds of statistics that we now realize need to be done. And so it's we can go back to interviewing people undergrads and not having enough statistical power, or we can go do the studies with 1,000 people on the internet. And when I read something like this, where what you get is what was it? 39 people?
Yeah.
Over the span of months.
Yeah.
In-depth interviews, asking them about all kinds of stuff. They're the statistics, they actually report statistics here that were done to come to these three foundations. It's not as if they weren't statistically savvy and looking at ways of organizing the data that they collected, but the richness that they have and the way that they present their findings, what would even be the statistical question here? It's just a different form of learning, and a form of learning that I think we should just integrate more.
Yeah. Or switch to. Because honestly, I was thinking this is actually great news, because I thought, social psychology is just irreparably fucked, with all the various problems, and not just the replication crisis, but the measurement problems, all the stuff we've talked about forever. Yeah. And then it's oh no, you could just go back to doing this and it would be great, I think part of the problem is I don't think he feels the burden of presenting some kind of hypothesis and then experiment that tries to refute the null. That's not that. That's not the method here. And it's just, I think, basic coding, right? You code that, and then the ultimate thing that you report is low, medium, or high for these different kinds of vignettes. But in exchange for whatever you're supposed to get from all those statistics, in exchange for not getting the power and whatever whatever it is that is supposed to come of that, whatever the benefits of that are supposed to be, which are often unclear, besides just seeming like science, you get the richness of just being with these people for months and talking with them and actually getting to like ask them questions. And it's not just mechanical, like M-Turk people responding to, if they even are responding to it honestly and not having like some AI do it. Like, it just seems such an easy trade, but not easy institutionally and like structurally.
Yeah. And these are methods that require a lot of care and training themselves, and social psychologists just like that's not what they're trained to do. Shweder is obviously like a big exception. He's somebody who's trained as an anthropologist. And like, just to note, like there's a lot of collection of these data, but like some statistics are used. So it says on the basis of the theme profiles for the 39 incidents, Much, or however you say her name, utilized various statistical procedures, including cluster analysis and stepwise discriminant analysis to distinguish 3 clusters of conceptually linked themes and to identify the degree of saturation from each cluster. But this is like qualitative work. So this is what you do when you collect enough qualitative work and you're trying to just like find overall themes. Like then it just seems like a fair thing to do. But like I find myself just agreeing with you. Like, and this is the challenge that I would give anybody who's suspicious of this. Read this paper and then read like the latest, greatest paper on moral foundation theory. Read those two and tell me, do you feel like you knew more about human psychology like from this one or that one? And like, I would put money on that you feel like you have a richer sense of what the mind is like. After this one.
But it's hard to be Shweder right now as a working social psychologist.
Like, who's going to say, like, Pizarro, go ahead, go to South America for like 6 months and interview 30 people. And it's not even disheartening to me anymore to think that there's more valuable information about moral psychology in this one article than there is in like 20 of my own articles. Like, it's more inspiring at this point.
Yeah, because it's not like when we talk about William James and it's like, well, everything is so different back then that, you know, like you could just be this one guy who writes these massive volumes on psychology that contains long quotes of like doctors that they've talked to or something like that. Like here, it's like, this is a guy who's still working today and wrote this paper like 25 years ago or what, I guess 28 years ago, and like wrote a lot of stuff in this vein and using these same kinds of methods. It's just like, it's not an easy fix. It might even be impossible structurally, but like, it does seem like, it should be inspiring.
Yeah. And of all people who should be willing to take a bit of a risk on this stuff, it's full professors already. And, you know, we're not risking our job. We're not at University of Texas.
I know. You know, like, it's a similar kind of thing for when you read something like by Thomas Nagel or something, you know, like in philosophy. And you're just like, why don't we go back to this, you know?
Well, because you don't have 4 objections to the monogamy defense.
Yeah, like about whether I'm going to focus on the bad-making features of non-monogamy or the good-making features of monogamy. Like, it's just like, oh, wait, we could just do it this other way. On the one hand, it's like clearly better. But then it's like, but okay, how are you going to actually do it is the problem.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to commit to doing in-depth interviews about disgust and purity, because why not?
Why not? Exactly.
Yeah.
Good. I totally support that. I guess we didn't really get into the details of the 3 foundations that he talks about, but we've certainly talked about that before. We've talked about moral foundations theory in the past. So if you want to get more of a detail about that aspect, I would refer people to when we've talked about moral foundations theory.
Yeah. And I highly recommend anybody reading this to read this paper if you're interested.
Yeah, it's very cool paper, and it's kind of, it wanders, you know. In a
it wanders, like, sorry, that's why we're wandering.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts? I'm going to go watch my Cougs. Try to make the Elite 8.
No, go watch your Elite 8, and may the ethic of community be with you and as you celebrate your sports teams.
Yeah, like how do you justify rooting for Houston and not rooting for Iowa?
It's like the good making feature of rooting for Houston.
What is the morally relevant difference?
I think, you know what's wrong is watching only one porn star. It's morally impermissible to watch only one porn star.
Wasn't there someone that said we're like morally obligated to watch porn of people we're not attracted to or something like that? Or
We did a paper that you're morally obligated to date people who you don't find attractive.
Yeah.
Which I objected to, and you were a little more sympathetic to.
No, I don't think I was sympathetic to that. I think I shared the view that you're attracted to who you're attracted to. You got, right, you were saying that it's okay to only be attracted to someone of like a certain race.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I mean, like, the one thing I just maybe wanted to say that we didn't get to is, like, he gets very normative about the health stuff at the end and worries about a kind of neo-Puritanism where the state is going to control medicalized life practices. And at this point, it's so normative, like where he says, informed by moral metaphors of South Asia, we would prefer a future scenario in which individual persons adopt a discourse in which their own health was considered a life goal, a personal duty, and a good to be achieved, like a satisfying career, economic security, or a satisfying network of community relationships. We would much prefer this to a horrific alternative of a centralized medical hegemony in which individuals and even local communities lose the capacity to define the limits of a moral way of life. So, I mean, like, you don't see this in a, like, psychology or, someone who's just making, like, political theory claims in a way, but ones that he thinks follow from just understanding the richness of our moral psychology and our moral lives.
Yeah. I think that given that this was an edited volume, and I've on record been disparaging of edited volumes.
There are advantages,
Yeah, it gives you the freedom. And, Paul Rozin was one of the editors, so he's going to say, go crazy. And so here you get to speak a little bit beyond the data, but in a way that's just fundamentally interesting. I also find it really interesting that such a foundational paper on, these like moral foundations is in a volume on health.
Yeah.
Like the psychology of health.
Yeah. Very cool. Yeah. And I think has implications. I don't agree with all his prescriptions, but I appreciate them and I'm glad. I think it just makes it all much more interesting and just a richer experience to read it. So I agree with you. I urge everybody to read this paper. All right. That's all from us this time. Join us next time on Very Bad Wizards.
The great boss has spoken. Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain.
Who are you? Who are you? A very bad man.
I'm a very good man. Good man. They think deep thoughts, and with no more brains than you have.
Pay no attention to that man.
Anybody can have a brain.
You're a very bad man.
I'm a very good man. Just a very bad wizard.